What they need to do is to evolve and adapt to this new age of individualism. I mean, really ask yourself how humans have managed to survive for this long. It's because we know how to adapt and evolve as the world continues to develop. It is absolutely clear to me that the average person is having a much harder time finding someone to marry or have a serious relationship with, or even become friends with on a deeper level.
So I think one thing that I'm noticing he's not acknowledging, and this isn't to discredit him or anything, but it's more so that I'm more of a fervent believer in the idea of tradition than probably most people. It's that I think we as a society do need to revert back on some things. I think we took elements of being materialistic and superficial a little bit too far. And that's kind of straight into a culture where meaning and purpose doesn't really matter. And so
it was the existential philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre that said, "Man is condemned to be free, because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he."
This is like the first 11 seconds of the video, and we're already getting pretty deep. So, freedom, I've actually made a video on this, and I'll link it in the description at the end of the video. But, freedom isn't necessarily free. Freedom does not mean freedom from consequence. What freedom means is the ability to do things of your own free will. But that doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want. You see, the whole point of having freedom is that you exercise it in a morally virtuous way. That is, if you want to be a good and productive member of society, right? Where freedom comes with is the responsibility of taking care of yourself, taking care of your family, taking care of things. If you're only focused on the life you want to live and it's all about you, you're going to find that, freedom comes at a cost when it's only when you make freedom about yourself, right? Freedom isn't just about you. It's about your ability to, give value to the world. One of the tenets in the Better Happens Daily philosophy is this notion that if you want to live a better life, you have to develop your relationship with yourself, others, and the world at large. And if you only develop your relationship with yourself, then you essentially say life is all about me, and a life about you isn't very fulfilling because you need the second part of that philosophy, which is developing your relationship with others. You need to have social connection because you need to feel like you belong somewhere. And then finally, if you can't, or I should say not finally, but if you go too far in that realm, you're not taking care of yourself, you're only taking care of others, then you're not fulfilled in your ability to take care of yourself or pursue something out in the world. Developing your relationship with the world is all about pursuing, that which makes you fulfilled based on your contribution to society. So your work, your career, and stuff like that. But you can't overcommit to that because then you're going to burn out. So it's a delicate balance, and that's the true cost of freedom, is being responsible for everything you do.
He does. We are at the mercy of our freedom as each second passes by, and in many different cases, Generation Z is more free than any previous generation. So how could that possibly contribute to Gen Z's lack of purpose, and how did we even get to the point where our generation's defining characteristics are ones of nihilism and hopelessness? After some philosophical research, as well as my own observations and solutions, these are the questions that I'm going to attempt to answer in this video. Where it began, post-modernism. This is such a massive philosophy to try and explain in just one YouTube video, so please do forgive me if I misconvey an idea or I don't explain something properly. Postmodernism is a movement started in the late 20th century that denotes the shift from believing in one grand narrative or truth to life to multiple grand narratives. It fuels subjectivity, individualism, and most closely related to this video, an instability of meaning. We can break up the last couple thousand years into three stages: pre-modernism, modernism, and postmodernism. In pre-modernism, God was the truth. There was a central grand narrative, belief system, and ideal that the majority of the world followed, that governed their everyday life and thoughts. Then, with the development of the scientific method and scientific observation, modernism came in and kind of made God look a little less credible. It was then that the modernists said, science is how we will make progress and find truth, not God. Lastly, which is kind of the current era we live in, is postmodernism. Although some would argue we live in a more meta-modernistic or post-postmodern era, but that's not really important for this video. With the rise of media, the internet, and the globalization of knowledge through mass distribution, people started to think, well, maybe this whole God thing and this whole science thing doesn't really have too much credibility. Now, the amount of differing opinions, beliefs, and ideals have been taken to a whole other level thanks to the internet age and the smartphone. With a simple Google search, you can gain access to every single philosophy, religion, or any other belief system you can think of in just a few short minutes. And because of this, there are a million different grand narratives which you can adopt. A million different truths that all seem to have a solution to your problems. So when this happens, and you are constantly...
And so what I believe he's referring to when he says truth, I had a mentor who talked about, how we should define what truth means. What truth means is kind of your guiding principle in life. And so for me, my truth is better happens daily. And so everything I do to make sure I'm living up to that standard of truth and what that means. And so for you, it's going to be something different. And so what he's trying to say here is that because the world now has more truths and grand narratives than ever before, it's kind of hard to pick which one. And that comes, with the notion that because we're more free, we have more opportunity to pursue more truth. But more option doesn't necessarily mean more freedom, because then you're paralyzed by your inability to choose which truth to pursue. So, that's kind of the disadvantage that we're at, right? So not that every grand narrative that's ever existed has been the perfect one, but it's just that each one of them had their cost, and ours just happens to be that we have too much truth to choose from. And so, and I think this video is a good one. What is this? Gen Z, the first generation with no purpose. Because that's kind of where we're at. It's not that we don't have purpose even necessarily. It's just that we feel lost in the search for truth and purpose in our lives.
If you're a young person in Generation Z and you've been unable to really connect with people on a deeper level, a good portion of that is probably due to the fact that most people lack the ability to dive deep into themselves and don't really want to anyway in our current society, which does not value that. And I'm certainly guilty of all this too. I sometimes let a TikTok on red flags you shouldn't ignore from a woman affect my entire perception of a woman in real life. I lift weights partly because I enjoy it and it makes me feel good, but also because I know people in modern society will perceive me as having higher value, and I use polarizing titles and thumbnails, just like this video, to grab your attention. At this point, it's almost...
Yeah, and so, one of the things that social media and the internet can do to kind of control your perception of things is make you believe a simple generalization about maybe a personal experience that the person putting out that content had will affect your entire perception of everybody in that group. So like what he was talking about, that video he was talking about with like the red flags from women. I've watched videos like that for sure, and I've been like, oh my gosh, are all women like this? And so then I go out into the world thinking that this is how all women are. When that's not necessarily true, or something that somebody else said was a red flag, I might notice a hint at that red flag in somebody, and it actually just kind of be me overthinking it, or it could just be true, and some people are mean, but it's like that's besides the point. Regardless, it's very important that you understand the difference between learning intellectually and learning based on experience. It's much, much better to have more life experience than it is to have a life intellect experience. And what I mean by that is it's much more wise and profound for you to have lived life and lived experiences and learn from them than it is to just try and research on the internet and read as much as possible to try and learn and then go out and apply, because it's just better that you go out and apply and live life than it is for you to kind of take a passive approach at developing yourself and developing your life experience.
So now we have to ask this question. What can the average person in Gen Z do to feel like their life has more purpose and meaning, and how can one feel more alive rather than feel like they live in a hyper reality? Well, the typical answer to this that most people in the self-improvement space are advocating for is to go back to tradition. We need to go back to a time where we only had one grand narrative, put our faith in God, get off social media, and start building communities again. So basically a return to pre-modernism. Now, for a lot of people, this can be a great solution to their individual life, if they are capable of doing so. But what about the people who find themselves constantly surrounded by postmodernists or people who live in a hyper reality? And if this trend continues, it's only...
So here's what I do want to say. I do think that even if it's not easy, you should try and have some element of tradition in your life. Because what tradition is what we're actually lacking, which is certainty. So what tradition is it's an element of certainty that satisfies you mentally and emotionally, psychologically, physically, and it provides that level of certainty. And so it's why you see people who are rather religious kind of stubborn in that. It's not because, that they're full of, this zealousness, but rather because they're very confident in the kind of certainty that having tradition or religious beliefs can do for them, and they really do believe that they can do that for you. Not them as people, but like religion and tradition can do for you. I think one of the core reasons why Gen Z might have a struggle when it comes to purpose and meaning is because we've strayed farther and farther away from tradition and a lot more into materialism and this kind of postmodernist philosophy than we realize.
It's going to become harder and harder to find that connection and intimacy that most humans are lacking from their life. Like I critiqued in my video on the masculinity crisis, I do think that in most cases, past traditions are not going to be the one right solution to present day problems. Encouraging people to get off social media and spend more time outside is very good for their physical and mental health. But if this new way of living gets bad enough, I think what humans are going to do, or what they need to do, is to evolve and adapt to this new age of individualism. I mean, really ask yourself how humans have managed to survive for this long. It's because we know how to adapt and evolve as the world continues to develop. It is absolutely clear to me that the average person is having a much harder time finding someone to marry or have a serious relationship with, or even become friends with on a deeper level.
So I think one thing that I'm noticing he's not acknowledging, and this isn't to discredit him or anything, but it's more so that I'm more of a fervent believer in the idea of tradition than probably most people. It's that I think we as a society do need to revert back on some things. I think we took elements of being materialistic and superficial a little bit too far, and that's kind of straight into a culture where meaning and purpose doesn't really matter. And so, like, not that you necessarily need to be religious. If you are thinking about it, I do advise you try. More so that you are able to create a level of certainty rooted in something meaningful. If you create a level of certainty rooted in something like social media, that's why you're not going to feel purpose.
So loneliness and a lack of connection with other humans is already starting to become the norm. If this is the case, and enough humans are starved of this intimacy, then eventually the brain will have to evolve and adapt to reflect this change. Meaning that, and yes, this is gonna sound crazy, I think one day the human organism is no longer gonna need as much social connection as it does now in order to function optimally. But that's probably gonna take hundreds of thousands of years after you're already dead. So what you need to do right now is force yourself and your brain to start to adapt to the current times and become more self-sufficient.
So here's what I will say to that, and I'll kind of disagree on that. It's that you can try and force your brain to connect and make the kind of neurological connections he's referring to. But if it's not good for you mentally, like if you find that you're trying to fight a battle that's causing more resistance than is necessary, and it's coming at the cost of your ability to do work, provide for society, have relationships, then ask yourself, is that worth the cost? Like, it's like he said, like, it's going to take hundreds of years. It takes a long time for the brain to evolve at a level that is just a norm for all of humanity. And so, like, even with this being said, like, America's not the only country in the world. There's other countries that don't even have internet. So it's like, what, are we going to be more evolved than they are, and they try and catch up, and so they're always behind? It's like that's not necessarily, I don't think, a viable solution. Like, I do think that, because, like, yeah, put it this way. Let's put it this way. We have craved social connection since the conception of humanity. So not only do we have to unwire all of the evolutionary or historical grounding that it took for us to get to a point where we were reliant on social connection. Not only do we have to undo that, but we have to establish new one, and then do it in a way that lets us be functioning beyond that. So it doesn't just take the time to force our brain to do these new things, but it's unraveling thousands of years of human conditioning, culturally and psychologically, biologically. So I see what he's saying, but I think for you as the individual, it's important for you to recognize that, don't do things that come at the cost of things that could potentially mean something to you. But I do see the significance in what he's saying for sure.
This is a concept that I've been playing around with in my head since I've had the idea for this video, and I'm just gonna call it the on-off social switch. This is a state of being you get to in which you can overpower your primal brain's need for intimacy and social relationships, and you yourself learn how to produce those same sort of feelings within your own organism. I feel like to some extent, people like myself who are introverts have already learned how to do this pretty well. I enjoy spending most of my time alone anyway, and derive a lot of the pleasure I get out of life from my alone time. Understandably, I can see myself getting a lot of criticism for even suggesting that humans should try to evolve out of our natural need for social connection, but it just seems like with the way things are headed, returning to monk is probably not gonna happen. Ever since
So, and what I will say is he does bring up something that I often contemplate myself, where it's like, is this the new reality? Because if it is, then it's like, I have to come to terms with it. So don't get me wrong, like sometimes, like, I actually do happen to believe that if there's going to be a new evolution in the way the human race evolves in the coming years, it's not going to be physical or biological, but I think it's going to be more mental and psychological. And so he's playing around in the right direction. And I actually do kind of support that whole notion of, kind of letting our brains evolve in a different direction, partly because it has to. I don't see the internet going anywhere anytime soon. It's just, I don't see a replacement for social connection if there's not a positive stimulant, if that makes sense. So it's like part of why our brain evolves in certain directions, right? Is because there's a sort of positive reward at the end of it. So, but like with our desire for social connection, I don't see a replacement for genuine social connection if you're not an if you're not an extrovert. Or did I say that right? Yeah, unless you're not an introvert. Sorry. Because when you're an introvert, yeah, you're more capable of being by yourself. But when you're an extrovert, it's like that's still half the population. But even as an introvert, you still need social connection and physical contact with human beings. So he's actually playing in the right direction. I do think it's capable of being refined a little bit more, but no, he's definitely bringing very innovative ideas, and I love where he's going with it.
There will always be people who understand that social media in many aspects still isn't real life, and there will always be people who will not use it and not let it affect their perception of the world too much. I don't think it's as extreme as Baudrillard probably thought it would be, nor do I think it's as extreme as the people who are trying to make money off of you by telling you how to escape the matrix are making it out to be. But I don't know, I'm just a guy on the internet, a sign among signs, a mere object of a brand that is more real to you than the real Cole Hastings himself.
It's funny. We were just talking about how these symbols and signs and other things are controlling us, and in some way the irony in what he was saying is that he is just some guy who is trying to impose his influence, his ideas onto you and onto me, and I'm doing the same thing by doing that through this video. But that's what freedom is do you trust him? Do you trust me? And are you making the deliberate choice to learn from me and the deliberate choice to learn from him? So freedom isn't all bad. I don't mean to make freedom out to be the terrible thing. It's just the responsibility of individual choice comes at more of a cost than we're willing to admit sometimes. So no, I love his unique approach to philosophy and innovative ideas.
There is an idea of a YouTube Cole Hastings, some kind of abstraction, but there is no real YouTube me, only an entity, something illusory. And though I can hide my cold gaze, and you can hear me talk about stories and watch my mouth move, and maybe you can even sense our lifestyles are probably comparable, I simply am not there.
Thank you very much for watching today's reaction video. I really hope you appreciate Cole and a lot of the innovative ideas that he has to offer. With where the self-improvement space is, I definitely think he brings a new sort of perspective and philosophy on what self-improvement has become. I wanted to dissect and bring up 3 things that I learned personally, but 3 things that were just easy to explain. And one of the points is that he talks about is that freedom isn't free. And what I mean by that, it's not that you don't have freedom, but more so it's that just because you have freedom doesn't mean you are free from consequence. Right? Freedom is about a test of character. What we mean by freedom isn't free. It doesn't mean freedom from consequence. Right? In fact, it almost means the opposite. Because when you go out and you do bad things voluntarily, it shows that you did that voluntarily. Nobody coerced you to do it. Number 2, to physically go out and live your life. Right? We live in a very technologically centered world. And what that can mean is that we spend most of our time on our phones, on our computers, watching videos, doing whatever it is to just pass the time. And that can cause genuine mental health issues, right? As we've seen with the rise of technology, also came the rise in mental health problems in young people today. And so the way to combat that is for you to genuinely figure out what it is you can do to live life at your best by being around people and by genuinely building and leading in a meaningful way so that you can actually develop what a better life looks like for yourself. And finally, be okay with being alone. That's almost contradictory to what I was just making in the last point, which is, to go out, live meaningful lives, connect with people. But being okay with being alone isn't necessarily about isolating yourself. What being okay with being alone means is to understand that there are times in which you are going to feel by yourself, or you're going to feel alone. And the way to combat that isn't to constantly stress yourself by being around people. The best way to live life in that regard is to learn to be content with what it means to live a more stoic lifestyle. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and ring that notification bell so you never miss another reaction video from us again. Have a wonderful day, my friend.